Support for this episode comes from Omnipod. You know I'm a big fan of choice when it comes to diabetes technology. I get so excited when there's something new. If you live with diabetes, you deserve to find the best fit for you. That's just one reason I'm working with Omnipod to help spread the word about what makes it so easy to test their system out. If you want to try an insulin pump or see what life without tubes is all about, you can try Omnipod even if your current tubed pump is in warranty. Really, you heard that right. And if it's not right for you, no problem. Omnipod does not tie you down with a contract or a tube. Go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Omnipod logo. Terms and conditions apply. For full safety risk information and free trial terms and conditions, visit omnipod.com/diabetesconnections.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
This week, my guest says diabetes is the least interesting thing about me. I don't actually like talking about it. But Clare Edge wrote a fantastic new book all about a diabetic witch. Accidental Demons features a middle schooler who can't stop conjuring demons when she pricks her finger. We'll talk about Clare's story of finding her way in the diabetes community, fighting the pursuit of perfection, and a lot more. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Welcome to another week of the show. You know I'm always so glad to have you here. We aim to educate and inspire about diabetes with a focus on people who use insulin. I'm your host, Stacey Sims, and I am just back from Mom's Night Out Denver. We took an extra day, and that's why this episode is coming to you just a little bit late. But Denver, thank you so much for an incredible event. I'm going to share more about this, online. We'll do a write-up. We do a trip report for every conference, and this one really touched my heart in so many ways. Here's one really quick example. We had a mom who is moving to Denver. She lives pretty far away, but came in for the conference hoping to meet some other local moms. And she sent me an email over the weekend. She found a mom group. She found a potential babysitter for her type 1 kid. She's looking at jobs. She's trying to figure out where to live. And these moms are already helping her. This community is second to none, right? We know how great the diabetes community is, but the hard part is finding it, right? Finding these amazing people. We are going to the Philadelphia area next. Mom's Night Out Philly is happening October 25th and 26th, and our early bird special pricing ends this Friday. So please do not miss. I also have to just give one quick shout out to Matt Tarro. He called me a couple of weeks ago and said, "Hey, I'm in Denver. You want me to come take some pictures?" Matt is a professional photographer. He's been on the show before. I'm going to link up his information because Matt's just amazing and a great advocate for men with type 1, dads of kids with type 1. He's the real deal. Matt, your pictures are incredible. I cannot thank you enough. Thank you so much for reaching out and for coming to Mom's Night Out. Okay, my guest this week is Clare Edge. Clare showed up in my Threads feed. I've been using Threads since it came out last year, but I think this is the first podcast guest that I found through that platform. She's terrific. And, when we talk about books about diabetes, fictional books, there really aren't a lot of what they call middle grade novels that feature anything about diabetes. There are a lot of children's books. There's picture books, right? I love those. But I'm so excited that this one is aimed at kids 8 to 11 years old. Now, I have read it. I think anybody can enjoy it. You don't have to be a middle schooler. It's really fun. We're also going to have a giveaway, so please watch for that on social media and in our newsletter. Toward the end of this interview, Clare does talk a little bit about her struggles with disordered eating. I really appreciate how open and honest she is about her entire story with diabetes, and that is coming up right after this. Managing diabetes doesn't need to get in the way of your passion, your social life, or your budget. EdgePark can help you simplify your diabetes journey so you can focus on other important things. EdgePark offers a wide array of continuous glucose monitors, such as the Dexcom G7, Freestyle Libre 3, and more. Plus, EdgePark accepts most insurance plans and handles the paperwork. Go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the EdgePark logo to learn more. Clare, welcome. Thank you for joining me today. I'm so glad you could make some time.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm 5 days out from debut, so it's a bit chaotic right now, but I'm glad that we found the time to chat.
Yeah, congratulations. Before we go any further, tell me about the book. I want to talk more about the specifics later on, But tell me the story.
The simplest pitch for this book is really quite simple. It's called Accidental Demons, and it's about a diabetic witch who can't stop conjuring demons when she tests her blood sugar. And it's a lot more complicated than that, and it's also that simple. And it's a middle grade fantasy adventure novel a la Percy Jackson, that kind of ilk. And it's set here in Missoula, Montana, where I currently live. And it's kind of a magical version of Missoula with some local lore and some fun diabetes rep. I mean, as fun as you can make diabetes rep, but it's, I think, the first traditionally published fantasy novel with a diabetic main character, which is wild.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah, I get asked quite a bit from other parents, what books would you recommend? And not, quote unquote, learning books, right? Fictional. And there are a few fictional books mostly meant for adults. There's a couple of thrillers, and there's a few younger, there's a lot of books for kids under the age of 6, I would say.
Yeah, there's board books and picture books, and also there are diabetic side characters in some things. A friend and colleague, Sarah Glenn Marsh, has an amazing young adult horror novel called The Girls Are Never Gone that has own voices, type 1 diabetes rep, and the main character has a diabetes alert dog named Waffles, who was definitely impactful in us naming our corgi Carbs.
I love it. Oh, that's great. Before we go any further, tell us your story. You live with diabetes. When were you diagnosed? Do you mind sharing your story?
Yeah. 20 years ago, I was diagnosed when I was 16, right before my 17th birthday, 3 weeks before I was going to take the ACT. For the third time, I think I was very academically focused. And I had a strange diagnosis story because I didn't really get sick. We're fairly certain that I got the flu on the way to Washington, D.C. for the close-up international relations high school thing that they took kids from all over the country and brought us to D.C. And we fundraised all year for it. And I was really sick the first part of that trip. And then I was really thirsty the second half of the trip. And then I had a routine physical for track when I got back, and my blood sugar was 300, which is not great, but is also not necessarily indicative of type 1 diabetes. And so they thought maybe I was type 2. They did a blood draw. I grew up in a very rural part of Montana. So it took days. It was the early 2000s. It took days. And my doctor or nurse practitioner was shocked. She called my mom and she was like, Clare is a type 1 diabetic. And we didn't really know what that meant. There was only one other diabetic in the school who happened to be my little sister and big brother's big sister.
Oh, wow.
Which was kind of wild. She had a much more dramatic diagnosis story. The main thing I remember from that year is to get on an insulin pump, we had to drive 8 hours to the only prescribing endocrinologist who would prescribe an insulin pump.
Wow.
To a 17-year-old in 2004. I have been managing and not managing since then. And it's been a bigger and smaller, like it's part of my life always. But I am realizing in publishing this book that I'm not especially interested in diabetes. Like there are people for whom they have it and they're interested in it, and it becomes a special interest of sorts, both the management and the research and all of that kind of stuff. And for me, I'm like, I just want to get through it. I want my pump to do as much of it without me thinking about it as possible. I want in my storytelling to make it as legible as possible. And I want to make it as authentic to diabetics as possible and as legible to non-diabetics as possible. But as I've had to explain diabetes to my publishing team over the years of like getting this book published, I'm like, oh, I am not especially interested in this.
I did see, in doing research to talk to you, I saw a post of yours where you said, diabetes is the least interesting thing about me. In fact, I don't really like to talk about it at all. Also me. Wrote a whole book about a magic witch who summons demons when she picks her fingers for her diabetes. So how do you then, how do you square those two thoughts?
I somewhat naively underestimated how much you have to talk about your own book. Like you don't just get to write it and put it out into the world and let it speak for itself. This is 2024. That's not how being an author works. And it was an idea that I kind of tripped over. Like a lot of my best ideas start out as jokes. I was working on a different novel. I was working on a different idea, and I was reading Cemetery Boys by Aidan Thomas, which is an amazing trans contemporary fantasy. And there's magic in it, but they talk about how they don't use blood in their magic because it's too powerful and it draws too much of their life force. So they have to be really careful not to like cut themselves when doing magic, I think is how it went. And I just remember going, well, I hope none of them are diabetic. Like that wouldn't be an option for me. So I literally posted on Instagram a joke, like a poll that was like, idea for a book, diabetic witch who conjures creepy ass spirits when she tests her blood sugar. Would you be interested? Yes or no? And 12% of people said no, which
They
was
don't like
weird.
blood. Maybe they don't want anything to do with blood.
But I just like the next day I sat down and I wrote the first chapter, and it hasn't changed much since. A lot of the book changed a lot over the journey. But that first chapter of like, she's a blood witch, like that was the conceit that was really interesting to me once I latched into it, is like, what if blood is a normal part of your life and your magic? And then you are diagnosed diabetic, which happens before the book begins, but we come in a few months later, and she's supposed to be only drawing blood to summon these helpful and less helpful, fun little mischievous demons from the other dimension. But then when she's making blood sacrifices all the time and she has all of this magical power in her, the demons start coming through whether she wants them to or not. And so she's sitting in science class trying to review kingdom, phylum, order, class, species, and meanwhile there's an annoyance, a class A mischief demon running amok through the classroom and no one can see it but her. And like that world just ballooned really fast in my imagination. And it only took me about 2 months to write the first draft of the book. And so the things that I am most interested in the book are not the diabetes things. They're the magic and the banter and the demon classifications and the really complicated family dynamics. One of the big themes of the book is that her grandmother holds beliefs that she has to kind of come face to face with, that maybe they aren't the best beliefs, and that she can love her grandmother and respect her, but also challenge her in some of her ways that are not maybe the best way to be in the world. So those themes, and like then just letting the character be a diabetic.
It sounds like life with diabetes, right? You have to focus on it and do that part of it. But as you have said, it's not the most, quote, interesting part of you.
Yeah. And it's like, I am interested in creativity. I'm interested in magic and witchiness and all of these things. And diabetes infiltrates every single aspect of my life. And so it does feel fitting to have my debut be a book about a diabetic witch as a witchy diabetic person. And at the same time, there is a pressure and a little bit of a nervousness of being a first, like being one of the first to do something with representation is a lot.
Well, and I want to ask you about that. Yeah. One of the things that's super annoying in the diabetes community, I'm sure you've seen blog posts and podcasts about this, is like a running total of things that movies and TV shows get wrong about diabetes. So I know you live it, you know it, but did you have anybody look over it? Are you worried that others might say that's not my story or that's not how I do it?
I had a lot of conversations about that. I did have one friend who I was diagnosed when I was 16 and the character is 13. So I had someone who I was close with who was diagnosed in middle school read for that experience of like, are there any things that I'm missing that would have been in, because my parents were pretty, they were involved to some extent, but I was a very fiercely independent 16-year-old. And I went to most of the doctor's appointments by myself. They did not learn the insulin to carb ratios. I did it all myself. And I realize now looking back on it that I was protecting them from the trauma of it a lot. I was doing a lot of emotional labor to try and distance them from the reality of what it was.
I hear that very often from people diagnosed, generally speaking. 16 is a little young, but like 16 to 20 something, because you're so concerned about your parents. But that makes sense then that you would want a younger person So she was the middle school.
Well, and if I had written this book now with all the publishing knowledge that I have, I probably would have made her 16, because 13 is a weird age for publishing. They don't like to let characters be 13. But I also think 13 is a really interesting age for kids in general, but especially for diabetic kids. And most of my friends I met are diagnosed younger than me. Some way older. I have friends who are diagnosed in their 40s. But there's something about 13 where you still have a lot of help. You're still being told what to do a lot, but there is a level of independence there. And I thought that her journey of figuring out existing in the world as a diabetic and her journey of understanding her place in the world with her family could mirror each other really well for 13.
Yeah.
And I do think that, and I hope that's the case in the storytelling. But when I talked with my editor, we decided not to get an official authenticity read for diabetes because the book is not trying to represent diabetes. It is just trying to tell one very subjective, very specific, very absurd story. And there were other aspects of representation that I wanted to use that resource for. So there is a Hmong character that we had somebody read for that. There is a queer Black character that we had somebody read for that. And I was like, I'm just going to trust my own lived experience, the experiences my friends and colleagues have shared with me, and also just know that there is no way I could write this book that would make every diabetic happy. It's impossible. It's impossible to create a piece of media that is going to speak to everyone's experience when there are millions of us with completely varied experiences.
I'm curious. I'm not that familiar with traditional book publishing. I'm a self-published author a couple of times over, and I had an editor, and it looks like from the outside, I think it looks very traditional, but it's not. I mean, my listeners know that. I say all that because I'm intrigued. What is this read for authenticity? Can you tell us a little bit about what that means?
Oh, yeah. That can exist in traditional publishing and in self-publishing, but it's this resource. Oftentimes, it's also sometimes called a sensitivity read or an authenticity read, where you've written something outside of your lived experience and you want to pay someone, or your publisher pays someone to make sure, not even to make sure that you've got it right, but just to be like, there are things that you don't know, and here I can help point them out to you. I have a friend who has done that actually as a diabetic, who has given a diabetic authenticity read to something. And there is definitely media produced where I'm like, this never touched a diabetic before it got to print. And it's hard because I feel like as a brand new author, I don't want to exist in the world in a place of critique of people who have gotten it wrong. I'm not here to point out media that has gotten it wrong, but I do feel like the best thing I can do in that instance is present media that is authentic to my experience.
Yeah.
And the diabetics who have read it so far via early copies, which are called advanced reader copies in traditional publishing, their messages have been so heartwarming and so affirming, and also just given me a lot of fortitude, because it hasn't been the easiest thing to navigate traditional publishing, of trying to get the type of representation that I like. The traditional publishing machine has been very good to me in many ways, and it's not terribly good at disability representation that is not an issues related thing.
Right.
And so that's probably why we haven't seen much of it in fantasy novels and things that are more fantastical and less issues driven, because it's like, yeah, no, mostly she's just a diabetic and a witch, and her problems arise from the confluence of those things in this circumstance. But the snarky demon and the friendship dynamics and the three cats, those are the things that hold the story together most of all. And when I was writing it, I realized that sometimes people say, write the book you wish you had as a kid. And this isn't completely that for me, but it is, I think, a piece of media that a diabetic kid or adult could hand to someone who doesn't understand. Be like, read this fun book. And I don't have to teach you, it's not like a YouTube tutorial. It's a fun book, and you're going to understand a little bit more. And maybe next time I'm low, you're not going to say, do you need some insulin?
Right. I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, because you had mentioned really right as soon as we started talking, you had to explain diabetes to your team. what came out of those conversations? Not just for the book. I'm really curious, like, what did they want to know? What did you feel it was important that they heard from you, and anything happened in that you were like, oh no? Right back to our conversation. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Dexcom. When I think about our family's use of CGM and Dexcom, it's hard to remember how we did things before. Truly, how did we manage when Benny needed something like 10 finger sticks a day when he was a toddler? We thought it was amazing to switch to Dexcom when it needed to be calibrated 2 times a day. Now, Dexcom G6 eliminates finger sticks for calibration and diabetes treatment decisions. Benny's fingertips looked just awful when he was in elementary school. When they got wet, you could really see how pitted and scarred up they were from all those finger sticks. Now they're healthy and smooth, which I never thought would happen back then. He doesn't even remember. But to me, it's everything. Learn more. Go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Dexcom logo.
There's a plot point in the book that the reason that she doesn't have a CGM and an insulin pump is that her family are witches. They don't have insurance. They haven't really needed insurance. And
I'm so sorry. I'm cracking up because on my list of questions is, why isn't she using a CGM? I'm like, oh, they're witches. All right.
They're witches.
So,
They haven't.
Obamacare hasn't reached them yet. I get it.
Yeah. Well, or they just haven't opted in. Like it hasn't, they don't have, in the book, non-magical people are called Geenan. They don't have Geenan jobs. They don't have a way to get insurance. They are living kind of outside of that.
I love that you thought of this.
Economic system. And in the sequel, that becomes an issue. There may be some magical solutions to some Geenan problems in the second book. But what she starts to set out to do is maybe there's a demon that can monitor my blood sugar. And so that kind of kicks off all of the hijinks of the book and where the adventure takes us. But there was someone on the team at some point who was like, well, why can't the coven just band together? And it was like, do you want the math on that? On like what that would be without insurance? Because like this family is doing okay, but they're not rich. And I think that there are a lot of people, if you haven't been, I feel like you have to both be close to a diabetic and close enough for them to trust you with the financial reality of it. Like people understand that insulin is expensive, but they do not understand the most essential piece of the puzzle, but that getting it into your body is not something that just happens. And so there was a lot of misunderstanding, and a lot of people had only consumed media where diabetes is, where either insulin is a murder weapon or diabetes is a plot point to raise the stakes for another character.
Right.
You know, you have the panic rooms or the Greenland, which actually does it brilliantly, but probably because a diabetic was involved in the production of that movie. It was strange to me what things needed to be explained and what didn't. And I don't fully have a clear memory of it, but some of the things just had to do with an editor wanting a scene cut because it slowed the pacing, and me needing to explain, like, it is supposed to slow the pacing because we need on-page time between here and here. I want the reader, there's a moment in the book, not too much of a spoiler, where she shoots insulin and forgets to eat her snack.
Well, that would never happen in real life.
Never. But the hijinks that happen between shooting the insulin and the blood sugar crash are not fully necessary for the plot of the novel. We could have 2 sentences that summarize it. But I want the reader to also forget about that she shot the insulin. So it was explaining to my editor that I hope the scene isn't boring, but the scene exists on page because I want the reader to get caught up in what is happening in the way that the character is caught up, so that when her blood sugar crashes, we also have that space on the page is important for the representation for what is happening in the moment. And my acquiring editor was wonderful about that. She was like, great, let's not cut the scene then. I understand the purpose it's serving now. But there were times like that, or like silly things, like technically, according to like grammar protocols, if a number starts a sentence, it should be spelled out. And I was like, we are not starting with a blood, like if it's 257 numerals, please do not write that out. My diabetic brain cannot compute a blood sugar reading written out longhand. We can't do it. I understand that the children will be learning bad grammar, but it'll be good diabetes rep.
I'll tell you what's funny. In my book, I wrote a couple of parenting books. They're called The World's Worst Diabetes Mom, because it's all about making mistakes, and they're funny, but they are real advice. But when I was writing The World's Worst Diabetes Mom, I had some interest from different companies, diabetes companies, to kind of sponsor the book or print the book for me. And they've done this for other authors, and I couldn't do it because it's so funny what they make you do. I couldn't say blood sugar. I had to say blood glucose every single time. Things like the numbers. I had to correctly spell. I couldn't say A1C. I had to say HbA1c. And I'm like, you know what? I appreciate you. Thank you for the money. We're going to put that over here. I'm going to cry that I had to put my own money into this, but I can't do it. And luckily for me, it all worked out great, but it was interesting.
Well, and that was an aspect too of like, when I read diabetes rep in a book and I can tell that it has been well researched but not experienced. Mm-hmm. It often is there. Like there's a book out right now that's very popular that I think it uses blood sugar incident over and over. Like there's a couple things where just my friends and I are like, well, now this has become kind of a funny shorthand of like, what if we did talk about it this way? That was where the rep was important to me with this book, was we are living on a knife's edge all the time, and having rep that teaches people it's not pedantic, but knowing that when her blood sugar is low, she is eating gummies, and she's low a lot in the book, and her blood sugar is also high a lot in the book. And I feel like there will be some critique of, why are her parents letting her blood sugars they're so all over the place. But I've also had diabetics be like, those first few months were exactly like that. Like I could not get my blood sugars to stay in range the first few months. Taking insulin is wild and it's really hard. And you also have all these social factors when you're a kid doing it. I also wanted the reality of that this is in the period of the book takes place over like a week. It's a very short time frame, but it's a really stressful one. And stress throws your blood sugars out of whack like nothing else. I could eat the most ridiculously carborific foods in the world, and that will not do me in the same way that stress can.
Wow.
And I wanted there to be a representation of that, and it also allowed for her to need to correct those in different ways. And so for young readers to see that happening, because like to circle all the way back, I meant to say this earlier, but in some ways I wrote this for diabetic kids, but I more so wrote it for their friends. I jokingly was like their asshole friend. Like, I do not think of children as assholes, but we've met children. And there is this, I have had extremely well-meaning friends in my life who have put me in danger in their refusal to understand what is happening in my body.
Yeah.
Like I had a friend who I loved dearly, who we were somewhere waiting on something. And I was like, I am low and I'm out of snacks. I have to leave. And she was furious that I was leaving. She's like, it's just going to be 5 more minutes. And I was like, I don't have 5 more minutes. I don't know this block of Manhattan. I don't know how close a bodega is going to be. I don't know, like the decision fatigue that goes on top of the physical sensation of being a diabetic. It was the other reason that I insisted the book be in first person, because I wanted people to be in her head. And if it were an older book, I maybe would have even experimented with form a little bit more in terms of like what low blood sugar feels like and looks like. But instead, I just let her get extremely silly sometimes.
You don't have to share. This is personal. But I'm always curious, do you mind sharing what technology, if any, you're using these days? Although all diabetes technology is technology.
I don't mind sharing. I'm also like pretty open about it on social media. So I use a T-Slim X2. I've been on it for a few years now. I use Control IQ with a G7, and they are frustrating, but the best things for me that I have found thus far, I have a very complicated relationship with some of the, like, I feel weird saying this on a diabetes podcast, but the whole Dexcom warrior thing for me is a little complicated, and like becoming more of a public figure and a public diabetic. I've had friends be like, well, why don't you reach out for like sponsorships and things like that? And I'm like, I don't actually know if I'm comfortable with that. Like, I prefer having a really fractured and complicated but necessary relationship with the technology. And it's the best that I've found for me. And some days I curse it to high heaven. And the complication of sponsorship when your identity is tied to pharmaceuticals in the way that ours is really tricky for me. And also, I worry that there's no direct technology mentioned in the book. Things are hinted at and whatnot, but I can't imagine a pharmaceutical company reading it and being thrilled with the way that big pharma is represented.
Well,
But like, that's just the nature of being a diabetic in a fallible system.
I will say that, and while this podcast is sponsored, right? I do commercials. I am not a person with diabetes, and I've disclosed, and my listeners are probably tired of hearing me disclose, but I think that your point of view is very common, very welcome. And I'm curious if you are a part. That was my next question. Are you involved in the diabetes community in any way?
I'm not. I feel like I don't know if I am.
Well, I'm asking like the mom, like, oh, I think you should talk to more people that feel like you and have complicated.
Yeah, no, I definitely talk to people that feel like me. I have a lot of diabetic friends, and the internet has hastened that. And I also have just the first month that I lived in New York City, when I moved back when I was in my late 20s, I moved to New York to be an actor with my MFA in acting. And I was in the bathroom at Chelsea Market. The woman at the sink next to me, when we were washing our hands, had the same insulin pump.
Oh, wow.
Like, oh my gosh. And we started chatting. We realized we were both actors. Like, we had tons of friends in common, and we're friends to this day. And so, like, I have a lot of relationships and friendships with diabetics, but I think part of being diagnosed at 16, diagnosed, I was so rural, like one other type 1 diabetic in my town.
Wow.
I never went to camp. And I also just had some bad luck in my early 20s of meeting diabetics who we just really didn't get along. And that's something I try and represent in the sequel, actually, is the moment of like thinking you're going to connect over this thing because you have this profound thing in common, and then you don't get along with the person, and it being like this cosmic betrayal.
I have
And
to say this to my son, my 19-year-old, who's always like, Mom, just because we have diabetes doesn't mean we're going to be friends. Leave me alone. Stop it. Especially when he was younger. I'd be like, oh, go. He'll talk to anybody. Like, he's like, oh, are you newly diagnosed? Let me share your story. You're going to be fine. But friends, he's like, I got to earn this on my own.
yeah. And like, there's something about being understood. And like, especially in New York, I kept meeting diabetics, and people would introduce me and be like, oh my gosh, this person's type 1. Or we would be in a co-working space and I'd see it. On the one hand, I'm like, I don't need to just bond with people over diabetes. And then I'm walking through Whole Foods and I see a CGM on somebody's arm and I'm like, hey.
Yeah, it's great. It's great. Doesn't mean you have to be best friends, but great to acknowledge.
Yeah. But I do feel like when people say the diabetes community on the internet, I'm like, what do you mean? And they mean a lot of different things, and there are a lot of different corners of it. And I also am like a fairly body neutral, fat positive person, and I had a really, really huge struggle with diabulimia in my early 20s. In my teens and early 20s, actually, I called it the high diet. And I let my blood sugars run high for a long time, and probably did some pretty irreparable damage to my body my freshman year of college and my senior year of high school, like those 2 years. And the healing that I have had to do to get to a place where I haven't considered restricting for years, decades now, like over a decade now, which is great. But the focus on control and the like achievements of A1C and some of that stuff tips me over into disordered behavior really easily. So I have to be really cautious for myself with the diabetic spaces that I enter to make sure that none of them are going to be triggers for me, because I know I'm very much my triggers are my issue, and I have learned to manage them. And I have, thankfully right now, like a care team in terms of my endocrinologist and stuff that are like, hey, not slipping over into disordered eating is the priority here over A1C. Going back to those behaviors is going to do a lot more damage than a 7.1 A1C is going to. But putting too much of my brain in that space can very quickly turn into me checking my CGM every 5 minutes and diabetes becoming my hyperfixation.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to say this articulately because I know what I want to say. First of all, thank you very much for sharing that. We don't talk about diabulimia enough. We don't talk about the risk of disordered eating in general when it comes to diabetes. I got some very good advice early on in my child's diagnosis that I think guided me to not have him look at his numbers as a competition. And I think having somebody like yourself available for kids, 13-year-olds, 16-year-olds, older adults to hear is incredibly valuable because we do see a lot of I'm perfect with diabetes and you can be too. But at the same time, while I want to reach through the screen and say, please speak at every event and make sure people understand, we know from what you've just said, that's not going to help you in the long run too, right? You've got to be really careful.
And that's part of, I think, why I have circuitously found my way to being an author, because I can put something out there that people can have a touch point with this, that they never have a direct touch point with me, that I can put something into the world that is saying the things that I want to say in a format that I want to say it in, but I'm not particularly interested in becoming any kind of a spokesperson. And I've written some nonfiction, some short stories and things, or short essays and things. I realized that I'm not a religious person, but I like the phrase ministry. Like, that's not my ministry. That's not my zone of genius. Like, the energetic exchange that is required of being a voice for and in a community, there will be parts of that come with being an author. There are podcast invites and there are kids who will write me letters, like that kind of stuff is very meaningful. And I take that seriously. Feels a little cliche, but it holds weight for me. But I have had like a profound realization over the last year that like the most that I can do for other diabetics in a lot of ways is thrive in my life, find ways to thrive in my life and lead by example, whether like whatever I'm creating in the world.
Before I let you go, you've mentioned the sequel a couple of times. Is it written or is it?
So the sequel is written. It is not yet edited and book made into a book. It is very much in process right now and is aiming to be out next fall, but we don't have a release date for it yet. But there will be a continuation of the story. Like, this story covers up through a bit of a cliffhanger, but not like the story is wrapped up, but there are some questions left unanswered, some adventures left to be had, some things to be explored in the second book.
Very cool.
The book is very much, it's about a 13-year-old and it is written for children, but almost everybody who has read it thus far has been an adult, and there's a lot in there for you too. There are some jokes in there that will go over the heads of the 9-year-olds reading. And just for parents who might be considering this book for their kids, it is appropriate for 8 to 12. But if you have an 8 or 9-year-old that doesn't do scary well, like some parts of the books get a little bit scary. So it might be worth doing a read through yourself or gut checking. But it is like age appropriate for 8 to 12. But judge your 8 and 9-year-olds scary, spooky levels appropriately, because there is, blood magic and weather witches and mind mages and conflict and adventure and mayhem demons.
So not that you prick your finger very often, because as you said, you use the G7 now, Dexcom. Do you think about this though when you do? Are you like waiting for the demons to come sometimes?
Less so the demons coming through and more so that like publishing owes me a lot of success because I have made a lot of blood sacrifices over the last 20 years. And I've had some very exciting things happen in the last few weeks that I won't be able to talk about for a while, but I was like, all those blood sacrifices paid off.
I love it. I love it. Clare, thank you so much for joining me. All the best. I'm sure we will talk again soon. I definitely want to talk to you about the sequel, and I'd love for you to come back. If you've got anything you'd like to share with us before then, please let me know. This was a pleasure. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
I'll link up more about Clare and her book in the show notes. And remember, we are going to have that giveaway. Watch on social media and in the newsletter. If you are not signed up for the newsletter, just go to diabetes-connections.com and scroll down and you'll see a link. I'll also put one in the Facebook group, in Diabetes Connections as a group. I haven't put a newsletter link there in quite some time, so we'll put that in. You can sign up and, make sure that you never miss a show and you never miss news from me, whether you are on social media or not. Thanks to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions, and thank you so much for listening. I'm Stacey Sims. I'll see you back here soon. Until then, be kind to yourself.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.
Gvoke HypoPen is a ready-to-use rescue pen for treating very low blood sugar in people with diabetes ages 2 and above. If you take insulin or sulfonylureas, you're at risk for your blood sugar going too low. Low blood sugar emergencies can happen unexpectedly, and they demand quick action. You need a safety net when it matters most. Be ready to treat very low blood sugar with Gvoke HypoPen. Find out more. Go to gvokeglucagon.com/Stacey. That's gvokeglucagon.com/STACEY. Gvoke shouldn't be used if you have a tumor in the gland on top of your kidneys called pheochromocytoma, or if you have a tumor in your pancreas called insulinoma. Visit gvokeglucagon.com/risk for safety information.